I am very happy for this final lecture to introduce Mustafa Minawi. He's a professor, assistant professor of history at Cornell University. He has a wide range of research interests that are focused mostly on the end of the Age of Empire in and beyond the Middle East. His work is very appropriate for this theme of the transregional approach to the Middle East that we've had going throughout the beginning of this semester. Many of his interests themselves are apparent in his recently published book, The Ottoman Scramble for Africa, Empire and Diplomacy in the Sahara and the Hejaz. It's a really excellent work, and today we're going to hear on something that comes out of that work, more or less. So please join me in welcoming Mustafa.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Is this working, or how does this? It's working. It's working? You can hear? Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you, Joseph, for organizing this. Again, I can't believe I'm competing with Obama. This goes down, like I just hashtagged it on Twitter. This is amazing. So thank you for being here. I'm assuming most of you tried to get tickets and couldn't, right? Or you're really committed to Ottoman history. I'm an Ottomanist. I should say this right at the beginning. I'm a historian of the Ottoman Empire, and my worldview kind of comes out of the imperial capital, Istanbul. But that doesn't mean it's limited to that. What I'm hoping to do today is to show you how one can be I believe one can be both a historian of the Middle East, in my case, during the Ottoman period, but and necessarily have to reach beyond the limits of what we think of as the Middle East in order to think of Middle Eastern history in a new way, but also to make sure that we don't miss a lot of the nuances that might matter in our understanding of the Middle East, particularly at the end of the 19th century. The talk that I'm giving today definitely comes out of my book, but it comes out of the kind of thoughts after the book came out. It's been 4 months. And I have not looked at the printed version because every time I want to open it, I get nauseous because I feel like I'm going to see a typo or something at the first page. But there's enough time now that I'm expanding my thinking about the historiography and the methodology that went into it, and then where I would want to go from there. So I'm going to share that with you today, and hopefully it will make sense. The reason I'm saying hopefully is because I'm using Prezi, which is very much kind of could be a linear representation of history. And what I'm going to be talking about hopefully will be a little more multidimensional. I tried to make it in such a way as you would be able to follow my thought process without having you kind of lose track of time. So if you start to get confused about what happened when, before, and after, stop me, and I will stop and explain. So the talk is Trans-Imperial History, North-South Divide. By North-South divide, I should say right at the beginning, I'm not talking about the divide that we always talk about when we talk about North and South, which is usually Europe and the rest. I'm talking about Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, which is a very real divide still till today. And it's a divide that I believe distorted a lot of our understanding, particularly of the imperial period during the Age of Empire, because in Empire they were not thinking in terms of Middle East, they were thinking in terms of Empire, which stretched well beyond what we think of as the Middle East. So this is what I meant by a linear representation of what I'm trying to talk about, but what I'm talking about is not very linear. I'm going to start in 1902, which is the end of the book, where I decided to. It's a very odd date to end the book. My publisher would have liked 1900 or 1915. But 1902 made sense because 1902 is when the telegraph line in the Hijaz, the work on the telegraph line in the Hijaz ended. This is the telegraph line that I started my work looking at. It's a telegraph line that it was the second telegraph line in the Hijaz that was supposed to connect Mecca and Medina with Istanbul. I started looking at the technical description of the telegraph line because I'm interested in technology, and my undergrad is in civil engineering. And a lot of the reasons behind what the government in Istanbul was giving about why they decided to go with this route, the red route. I don't know if you can see it clearly. There's a couple of routes, but I'm talking about the inland route, the red inland route. The reason they decided to go with this route did not quite make sense based on what they were saying. So they said that it's this inland route would be a route that would be protected from outside intervention. And in 1902, I wasn't thinking, what outside intervention are they talking about? This is early days before. This is before World War I. And they said that the alternatives that might be economically feasible would leave the empire at risk from other empires. Again, I couldn't quite make sense of it. So I started going backwards. The first thing I saw is they were referring to this man. His name is John Pender. He is an imperialist par excellence. He is British, and he had essentially by 1900 a monopoly over underwater telegraph lines. So the underwater telegraph lines were all built by British companies, even though they had different names that they used for the different companies that they used. Part of it is what John Pender did is whenever he would go, for instance, to build the telegraph line underwater for Germany, later for China and Japan, the Chinese and the Japanese and the Germans would get nervous about the idea that this John Pender, British guy, is actually going to be in control of the telegraph line once it's built, because the technology, there's almost a monopoly on technology, but in 1900, based on his company, and if the telegraph line was to go down, they would necessarily have to go to a British provider to fix it. So what John Pender, what we know now in hindsight, what John Pender started to do is create fake shell companies that looked like they are run by other countries, but in reality we know now that they were all shell companies that were run by him, because by World War I, when the order came to cut the telegraph lines, all telegraph lines that were not under British control were cut, whether they went from him or not. So part of the reason I got into all these details is because the alternative to the telegraph line that I showed you, that goes through the desert, that is that goes above ground, that goes mostly in territory that is controlled by the Bedouin tribes between the major cities in the Hijaz. Part of the reason they decided to go with that route is because the alternative would have to be dealing with this guy. Not just dealing with this guy, and then the British bureaucracy that comes with it. This is 1902, though. Why was the Ottoman Empire so nervous about dealing with British contractors, even with the British government? If you look just at the case of the Hijaz telegraph line and what's happening in that geography, it's very hard to actually figure out what they're saying. I had people, when I first started thinking about what could be the reason, traditional Ottomanists or traditional historians that work on the Ottoman Empire, unfortunately, usually go to the Sultan, and they try to figure out which Sultan liked which people for what reason, and they would give reasoning based on the Sultan's what we think the Sultan's cultural proclivities are. So in this case, it's Abdul Hamid. Abdul Hamid, people would tell me, oh, but Abdul Hamid doesn't like the British. We know that Abdul Hamid the second does not like the British. It makes sense that we really go, really? Do you think like there's something about that that didn't fit well? Because we're talking about trying to de-orientalize our analysis of the Ottoman Empire, but here we are, people that are working on the Ottoman Empire from the inside, accepting the idea that everything in the empire worked based on the irrational, if you will, likes and dislikes of a sultan. So I kept going, not knowing whether I'm going to find an alternative answer or not. So I started right at the bottom, at the level of the individual. So I went to this man. His name is Sadiq Azamzadeh. Sadiq Azamzadeh, or if you are an Arabist, it would be Sadiq al-Azam, is a Damascene aide-de-camp to the Sultan, who lived in Istanbul along with many people from his family. They lived particularly in Tashfikiye. Their properties are now partially owned by the Syrian consulate, believe it or not. Anyway, he was the guy that was responsible for extending the telegraph line into the Hijaz. So I started, instead of trying to figure out what could be the reason from up top, I started to follow him to figure out what his work would lead me to, without knowing whether it will lead me to an answer or not. So I started following him on his career and through the archives, essentially. And he traveled a lot, which makes sense if you think about it. A lot of the, particularly late Ottoman military diplomats, if you will, were assigned with different missions. Usually they had specialties. His specialty, I find out later, is really the southern frontiers, if you will. But I started following him to figure out what he was doing from between one project and the other to maybe shed some light on what's happening in the Hijaz. So he went, of course, to the Hijaz. Do you see the blue? I can't tell whether you. He also went, he spent a lot of time in Berlin. He actually went to the military school in Berlin. He also had, he went a couple of times to Kufra, really random. At least that's how it felt at the beginning. To Kufra in just south of, not just south, really deep in the Libyan desert. He also went to Ethiopia. And he wrote a lot. So trying to follow all of these documents that he left behind from all of these different missions to try and make sense of the last mission he was on was a bit difficult. But it took me back to 1882. See what I mean by like a little, I'm going in different dimensions? But stay with me. It will make sense hopefully in a second. So it took me back to 1882. 1882 is the first telegraph line that was built in the Hijaz that connected Jeddah to the rest of the empire. So this is, and it was a submarine telegraph line. It is that little extension up there. It basically what it did is it connected Jeddah across the Red Sea to Sawakin. And from Sawakin, it went through the Egyptian telegraph network all the way up through to Cairo, and then into Alexandria, and then submarine cable to Istanbul. That was 1882. Why would they in 1882? Oh, and the person that actually extended it, John Pender. So why would they in 1882 think nothing of allowing John Pender to extend the telegraph line underwater, a very short distance, and then in 1902, 20 years later, be completely adamantly against it? I mean, they're so adamantly against it that the Sultan himself wrote a letter to John Pender saying, do not show up in Istanbul again, because when he came with the proposal, he himself went to the Sultan. The Sultan did not give him audience, and then they sent a letter to him saying, we'll call you, don't call us. So there's a very kind of adamant refusal, even though they've used him in the past. So it didn't make sense in 1882, so I went back to figure out what was the relationship between the Ottoman Empire and Britain earlier on. And you can go back much earlier, but 1856 made sense. 1856 is what date? You don't. I'm sorry. Yes, exactly. So 1856 is the Treaty of Paris. And the Treaty of Paris is important because it's, of course, it's after the Crimean War, but it is also a time when the Ottoman Empire was officially accepted into the European family of nations. I love this picture because it's one of the very, very few pictures where you'll find the Ottoman representative actually dead center and facing facing the perspective of the drawer. I'll tell you why I'm making a big deal out of this. So this is Abdul Majid in his new garb that he was introduced into the empire, of course wearing a fez with embellishment, which is again new to the Ottoman Empire, but very much at the center of what they believe to be the family of nations of Europe. So the Ottoman Empire was fully accepted, and after that, not too long after that, they actually signed the first treaty in which they acknowledged the international rules of how to extend telegraph lines. The first was London, Paris, and the third was Istanbul. They're very much part of the heart of Europe. So it would make sense that they would continue in this process until 1879. 1879 is another treaty was signed, this time in Berlin, but it under very, very different circumstances. So 1856, we have the Ottoman Empire, the European powers theoretically being on the side of the Ottoman Empire to try and help the Ottomans maintain their control over Istanbul when Russia was marching down. 1879, after the 1878-79 Russo-Ottoman War, there was, of course, another meeting, but a lot has changed since then. The meeting that took place is known as the Conference of Berlin, in which a treaty was signed that gave up that basically gave where the Ottomans gave up most of their control on a lot of the major Balkan territories, actually the oldest Balkan territories in the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't a direct giving up of the Balkan territories, but it was basically giving up sovereignty over their territories until later on when they become fully independent. But it was a big blow. It was a big blow. Anytime that any part of the Balkans is taken away from the Ottoman Empire, as opposed to Libya later, or parts of the Caucasus, or parts of eastern Turkey, what is now Eastern Turkey, part of eastern Anatolia, the reaction that the public has, whether it is in press or in diaries, to a loss of territory can never be measured compared to what they would feel in relation to the loss of any territory from the Balkans. And the reason that is because the Balkans are really the heart of the Ottoman Empire. They're really not just the emotional heart, it's the oldest part of the Ottoman Empire. And it is, and for the Ottoman elite, it is what makes the Ottoman Empire, particularly a European empire. The rest does not matter as much, and it continuously comes up. Of course, the Second Balkan War, this would happen again. But this time, the treaty was signed. I don't know if you can see, this is a famous illustration of signing the treaty that gave up a lot of their control on much of the Balkan territories. The people that are shaking hands, the Ottomans are not even in the center of the picture. They've been kind of quite literally marginalized. You can actually barely, I don't know if you can see them. They're on the side, the fez wearing people. No, it's a drawing. But it's an illustration of how European press was reacting to what's happening in the Ottoman Empire. This comes a lot, again, with a lot of rhetoric about the beginning of this notion of the Ottoman Empire failing and the Ottoman Empire being the sick man of Europe, right? 1884. I'm jumping through all of these. I'll explain in a second. So we started with 1856, went to 1879. 1884, the Ottomans were back in Berlin again. So the Ottomans this time were back in Berlin in 1884 as part of the family of nations, European nations, but in the understanding of 1884 kind of international law, the family of nations were necessarily European for them to be considered sovereign nations. So in 1884, they're back in Berlin, but they're back in Berlin to discuss not the loss of more Ottoman territory, but to discuss laws, or to create basically a treaty that would help the sovereign nations be able to colonize what's left of Africa without creating conflict between the European nations. So of course, it's the Conference of Berlin. Usually it's called the Conference of Berlin for West Africa, or the Conference of Berlin for to discuss the Congo. There's different terminologies for it, but I'm going to call it the Conference of Berlin. And in it, the Ottomans were very much present. They were present not just as negotiating partners, but also as partners that had to sign for the treaty to hold. Because even though 1878 and 79 happened, the Ottomans still legally were part of the League of Nations, or the family of nations, of European nations. So they were there to negotiate the different rules that would govern which territories can be considered new colonial territories and under what circumstances, particularly in Africa. Again, I would love you to kind of point out where the Ottomans are here. No? Nope. Keep looking. Look for the fez. So it is. Hold on, let me see if I can do this. It's this poor, poor man over here. It is really an amazing illustration of how the Ottomans were not just, and now they're literally fading into the background. And he looks like he's drunk, like he's in the back by himself on a table, while others are discussing what's happening in over a map, and you know. But this is the representation of the Ottomans being there. The reason this is fascinating, because in reality, first of all, it was not one person. The Ottomans don't travel light. It was a whole contingent of headed by Said Pasha, who is the Minister of Exterior, and a ton of people that stayed in Berlin for 8 months doing this. And they took it very seriously. They took with them a whole horde of lawyers, international law lawyers, to make sure that they know what they're signing to and what are the agreements that would benefit the Ottoman Empire or not. You never see them mentioned. You never see them mentioned when we're talking about the Scramble for Africa or the Conference of Berlin. There's tons written about this conference, and they're usually like a footnote at the bottom. They would say that it's European nations, and then there would be a footnote that would say, but Turkey was allowed. Turkey, usually they called not the Ottoman Empire, to be part of it. It's very kind of an interesting rewriting of history, because it really does not fit into not just European narratives, actually into Ottoman narratives. Usually, Ottoman narratives, the reason I stopped at 1879, when it comes to Ottoman inter-imperial relations, with the Ottomans being an actor, a subject rather than an object. It's usually 1879 is the end of the road, because after that the Ottomans were still there. There's a lot of writing about the Ottomans trying to maintain whatever land they had. There's a lot of books about navel gazing of the Ottomans and what they need to do. Reforms within the Ottoman Empire. Almost none take the Ottoman Empire as an international player seriously. What I argue is that the Ottomans were actually taking their presence on the negotiation table very, very seriously, and not just very seriously. They took this opportunity in 5 years after 1879 went into effect, to reinstate themselves on the international arena, particularly as an expanding imperial power, playing by new rules of colonialism. I'm not going to go into detail about what that means because that's a whole other talk, and I would love to talk about it in the question-answer period. But I wanted to kind of pause here for a second to continue to continue with the main reason I'm here, which is to talk about the divide between Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. But so far, we are still in Europe. I took you from Hijaz, but then I went back to Istanbul. From Istanbul, we went to Paris, and from Paris to Berlin. We're still sticking with the traditional points, except now I'm starting to insert the Ottomans as serious players in international relations. There they signed something called the Act of Berlin. This is 1885 Act of Berlin. The Act of Berlin was incredibly important because it started to give legal terms for colonial expansion. It wasn't the first time, but it was definitely one of the more important times in which international law was created, not for the purpose of colonial expansion, but to justify colonial expansion. And this becomes a trend. I think in many ways it stays a trend. So a lot of my work now is about exactly that, looking at international law as law that stems out of colonial impetus, but also that continues to act that way till this day. But let me get back to the Ottomans. So the Ottomans were part of part of this conference, and part of the conference meant that they signed on the papers that would allow them to claim, according to the rules of the conference, which I'll get to in a second, this territory. This is an Ottoman map, obviously, and the pink area is what the Ottomans, in Ottoman atlases at least, designated as an Ottoman area. This is 1885. This is the area that they claimed as colonial possession after 1885. Of course, it's a rough, but it's basically, it's what they considered the hinterland of Tripoli, or Trablus Garb, and it went all the way down to the Lake Chad Basin. It's centered around what we now know as Boko Haram territory, unfortunately. But that is the area that they claimed legally as an Ottoman colonial possession. I keep saying colonial, not because I think that this distinction between imperial and colonial, the way we talk about it again in Ottoman history, is very useful, but because the Ottomans themselves started using a new word that was invented to designate this territory that would be very different than their relationship to the territories that are provinces and already part of the Ottoman Empire. Again, I'll go into that in detail and why the designation is so important. Part of it is kind of like us Ottomanists talking amongst each other about what is colonial, what is not colonial, which I'm not sure is very productive. But the other part of it is actually understanding the Ottoman rhetoric of diplomacy at that point when they're discussing this this new idea with their European counterparts, which is in complete contrast to, of course, the way they discussed their entitlement to a colonial possession there when they're talking to the power on the ground. And in this case, for the most part, it was the Senussi leadership. And there was no mention of colonialism or any of that, but I'm not going to get into that right now. I get into it in the book. What is interesting is that when I showed you that Azamzadeh, the dude with the mustache, went in, one of the places that I asked you to look at is the Kufra, which is, these are the lovely pictures that you find in Istanbul University, about his trip to Kufra. He was a big photographer. He was, like a lot of people in Europe and other places, his hobby was photography. He wrote a book on photography, but he also took a camera with him. Not the first time he went. This is the second time. This is 1895. 1886, though, he was there, and 1886. Most people started. Historians that work on Tripoli or Benghazi have. Is there a clock? Okay, there. Can you tell me when I've reached half an hour? Oh, fabulous! Thank you. They've made guesses about what this dude is doing in the middle of the Sahara, and most of them were about him collecting taxes or trying to enforce the collection of taxes for the empire. And this is kind of an old way that we think about the Ottomans at the end of their life. They are really obsessed with collecting revenue and survival on an internal level. The idea that this man was negotiating with the Senussi on behalf of the Sultan to try and claim Ottoman colonial territory by proxy was never mentioned. And it wasn't mentioned because we really never thought to look for it. We never thought to look for it because we really, the people that work on sub-Saharan Africa are people that are interested in Benghazi, from the Ottoman perspective anyway. People that are interested in Benghazi as a Sanjak or Trablusgarp as a province. This was usually a side note. But if you actually dig into what he was doing in Kufra and later further down into the Lake Chad Basin, a different story will emerge. If you skip it, you will assume it's about tax collection, which has been done. And this is what this dude, this is the territory, by the way, that they claimed. And I like, this is a map from a British atlas that was from the same period that has a very different idea about where the Ottomans were, what belonged to the Ottoman sphere of influence and what didn't. As you can tell, they give the Ottomans Tripoli, Benghazi, and Fezzan, the three green flags, the old flags of Tripoli, of Libya, but what the Ottomans were claiming had a lot less to do with Benghazi and Tripoli, and a lot to do with the three Sudanic kingdoms that are marked with the red dots. I don't know. Yes. This is a huge territory, and this is such a, I mean, because of the way we represent Africa, usually that looks like it's a tiny feat. In reality, it is to fly from Tripoli to the Lake Chad Basin is as long as it would take you to fly from Tripoli to Paris. So I don't know if that gives you a sense of what a huge chunk of land they're talking about. But it was massive, and the reasoning that they were giving for this new venture into new venture, because it has new terms of legitimacy, is because of the Act of Berlin. So the Act of Berlin, they particularly focus on two parts of the Act of Berlin. One, I mean, there are two specific doctrines. One is the Hinterland Doctrine. So the Hinterland Doctrine, which created the word hinterland in Ottoman, is about, it basically says, and this is very loose, that if you are already in a colonial possession of land along the coast or the water, they actually do not specify whether they're talking about the Mediterranean, Atlantic, or even the Nile Valley. But if you already have land that is recognized by the rest of us, Europeans, as part of your land, and you believe that claiming the hinterland of that land for the economic survival of that territory is important, you can apply to get the approval of the rest of the European territory, players to claim it. So that, of course, if you think about it, in Ottoman terms, they definitely have been recognized as having sovereignty over Trablusgarp, and they use Trablusgarp to talk about the three places. I mean, at least in Ottoman terms. So it's Fezzan, Benghazi, and Tripoli, and they definitely believed. They argued that everything from that point south to the Lake Chad Basin is actually could be considered the hinterland of Tripoli. And the reason they claim this is they gave they actually had they opened up a whole office in Istanbul that is about nothing but churning out legal arguments, international law legal arguments about the economic connections that have been there for centuries between, so basically the trade and the north-south routes from sub-Saharan Africa to Tripoli and Benghazi, but also the cultural and political ties that have been there for well over 100 years. They went about proving this in very different ways. Part of it is giving proof of that the trade that was still taking place, but a lot of it has to do with historical connection that required the approval of the Senussi leadership for it to actually matter. Again, I won't go into it in detail. What I want you to take out of this is basically that they were arguing using the Hinterland Doctrine and later the effective occupation doctrine that they legally have title to this piece of land. Now, why would they be going out of their way to claim the Sahara as part of Ottoman land? What is this expansion south would do for them? A lot. Other than the fact that this portion of land actually is where the north, south, east, west caravan routes actually intersected, which means you would control the caravan routes that would go from British territory to French territory, or from sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean. It also meant that they would be part of a global new form of imperialism that would recognize their very sovereignty, not just there, but as they exist in Istanbul. I will leave it there. I can go into this, but I'll leave it there. I'm going to continue back to what is it that I was talking about. So, between 1885, 86, and the Act of Berlin in 1895, the amount of diplomatic arguments between Istanbul and particularly London, you could fill books of the different arguments that were made by representatives of the Sultan and representatives of the High Court in London about why they wanted the recognition of London and later France for their possession of the hinterland, of what they called the hinterland of Trablusgarb. This continued despite the fact that in real terms, the European powers did not actually treat the Ottoman Empire as a full member or a full sovereign member of the family of nations, even though they legally were. And the reason they didn't is for a lot of the reasons that a lot of European nations don't treat the global South nations as fully sovereign. It's essentially about the argument that international law would apply, but who does it apply to, and in what cases changes based on the person, if you're considered European or not. It's a long other. But between 1885 and 1895, they definitely tried. They tried only through diplomatic methods when we're talking about Europe. There's no threats of military power. There's no threats of economic reprisal. But they're doing it knowing that they were broke. Of course, the Ottoman Empire is entirely broke. Actually, the people that are controlling most of their finances were Austrian, French, and British, and they were the ones who were making decisions about the spending habits of Istanbul, even for internal infrastructure. So they were broke, and also their military was no match to anything that the British or the French can have. So their only argument that they continued to make was really based on law. That, and a parallel, the other face of this coin is what they were doing, trying to figure out how to establish effective occupation using the Senussi and his powers in Central Africa. But I'm going to stay with the diplomatic interaction. So the reason I have 1895 as a major year is it's a year that in Ottoman documents is called. It translates into a farce, a diplomatic farce. And it is, the Ottoman diplomats know that a lot of what they get face to face with their European counterparts were empty words, essentially. But a lot, because they know also what the British and the French are doing and how their agreements are taking place outside without getting the approval of the Ottomans for what the Ottomans are claiming to be their own land. But they continue because stopping is not an option. Stopping is not an option because that doesn't mean they only would lose their claim to colonial possession, but also they would lose their claim to being a nation with sovereign rights. An empire with sovereign rights. So 1895 comes, and that charade has to end. And it's not because of what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa, it's because of what's happening in East Africa. This is when the British and the Italians officially decide to, Musawa was given officially to the Italians, which is technically an Ottoman, when I say technically, I mean it is, it's called the province of Equatoria, and so it is a real thing. It's taught in geography textbooks in the Ottoman Empire, but they had very little, Istanbul had claim over it through the Khidev. And the Khidev is of course not he's not a sovereign. Anything that the Khidev has control over, that means that the Sultan has control over. In this case, the Khidev, of course, signs away the right of his sovereign to Musawa by giving it to, and then the Ottomans start protesting. The protests fall on deaf ears, and Musawa is given up. And this is, I use Ottoman maps that are hand-drawn because I love them. And also because they give you a sense of how, these are in the documents when they're trying to actually explain to the High Port what is happening. A lot of these documents that are hand-drawn are actually drawn by the wives of the diplomats. And they usually get an honorary thing for what they're doing. Anyway, so this is a clear understanding of 1895 and where the Ottomans believed the British were heading. So there's Italian possessions, or there's also British spheres of influence. In the Ottoman Empire, they created two different kinds of terms for exactly that: spheres of influence versus possessions, and of course the French possessions. But that was basically the final straw. After that, we start to get the Ottomans funneling weapons into Senussi leadership from Derna that will eventually lead resistance against the French marching in after the Fashoda crisis. So the Fashoda crisis was really a turning point because it's a point in which the French and the British made they were about to get into open conflict, and then the agreement in London drew the line between what is French sphere of influence and what is British sphere of influence, and it went right through Ottoman claims without the Ottomans being involved. And that's when the Ottomans really abandoned the idea of diplomatic resistance, but they definitely started funneling weapons. The weapons continue, and all the way to 1916. First with the old Senussi, who died in 1902, then his grandnephew that continues all the way to 1918. So I'm hoping this kind of weird triangulation that goes through time, but also connects the Ottomans to Europe as a family of nations, but then by their connection to Europe, their claim to colonial territories in sub-Saharan Africa makes sense now to understand why in 1895, when John Pender showed up at the steps of in Istanbul, the Sultan decided that the British were more of a threat. Having a deal with the British was more of a threat than a benefit. Nobody makes a connection between what's happening in the Hijaz at the time with what the Ottomans were trying to do in Central Africa, and then how the British stopped them or reacted to their claims. So 1895 is exactly the year when the British give Musawa to the Italians. 1895 to 1900, John Pender, as a representative of the British government, private business that is actually part of the imperial project, which officially is rejected. So it would not make any sense for the Sultan, regardless of how cheap it was, regardless of the fact that he actually offered that the telegraph lines would only be set up to send messages in Ottoman and Arabic, regardless of the fact that he said that they would give full control of some of the stations that would be built inland to the Ottomans, as long as he has control over the underwater stretch. All of these do not make sense if you think that at the same time they were the same people that were negotiating over the telegraph line were also negotiating with the British over Musawa. it would not. So it's not it's not some sultan, or it's not some weird aberration of his proclivities, or the fact that he likes the French more than the British that led to this. It's actually quite simple. The reasoning the question would not even be asked if you actually took the Ottoman claims in Africa seriously. So back to this. When the arguments were going back and forth, and there was a lot of people against the idea of extending the telegraph line through the desert, that when the arguments were going back and forth about where to extend the telegraph line, whether to put it along the coast, to do it to make it underwater, which is of course the better technology by that time, or to have it completely exposed to raids from a lot of the Bedouin tribes that lived in between, particularly between Mecca and Medina. Everything in the documents that are coming from the provincial point of view argued for an underwater telegraph line, and then the Sultan's strategic small group that works on their international policy put the kibosh on it and went for the Ottoman-built overland telegraph line that would, despite the dangers that they were very aware of from the Bedouin tribes that lived there. I keep talking about the Bedouin tribes like they are, I don't want to. I would love to talk about the details of how that is actually a lot more complicated than just the Bedouin tribes against the government, and I will be more than happy to do that as well. But in general, they decided to go with an internally constructed, fully Ottoman constructed technology, using Bedouin help to extend the telegraph line in 1902 instead of going with the underwater because of what I just discussed. I gave you all of this using timelines, and then we're going through the chronological thing. I'm going to go for another dimension, if you will, and that is geographic. So same map. We start with the Ottomans extending their telegraph line into the Hijaz. We look about what's happening in Central Africa. From Central Africa, the point that I didn't talk about is that the Senussi was also negotiating with the Ottomans, so there's a lot of movement back and forth. And also the Khedive was negotiating with the Ottomans about what's happening along the border between what becomes Egypt and Tripoli. Ethiopia comes online. I didn't talk about that, but that happens after 1902. And the connection between what's happening in Central Africa and the Hijaz hopefully becomes a little clearer. If you don't take that serious, if you don't look beyond the line, which we usually look at, which is, North Africa is usually considered part of the Middle East, I would never have gotten to the conclusion that I had then. And it's not just this specific case. I believe that the cases are actually much more than just like this kind of aberration. It's not an aberration. The Ottomans have been dealing with sub-Saharan Africa for centuries before this, and a lot of the reasonings that we give for their international policy, because we don't take Ottomans having strategic international policies very seriously, rarely looked outside of the box. I'm looking now when I said Ethiopia, I'm looking now at why the Ethiopians got parts of churches in Jerusalem as well as real estate in Jerusalem by not thinking about it as a Jerusalem problem, but as a geopolitical problem. So I'm writing an article that's called "The Road to Jerusalem from Addis Ababa Goes Through Istanbul," and it's specifically it's tied to the colonial project that Ethiopia and the Ottomans were trying to prevent coming from Italy. This is where I will stop and open it up for questions. Thank you for listening to me. Yeah, please.
Without going into too much detail
Mhm.
on the Bedouins,
Yeah.
I seem to recall from the reading that actually there was some sort of transformation where they were more of an issue in the 1880s than in 1902. Maybe I'm misreading.
No, they were considered more of an issue in 1880s than in 1882. That doesn't mean they were.
What happened actually?
No, but that's the thing. That what happened is that the Ottomans really. So the
Nothing changed. It was just how the Ottomans viewed them.
no, it's how the Ottomans viewed the relationship with the British. The alternative was more dangerous. So the alternative in 1882, what they were weighing, excuse me, in 1882, and the terms of the argument were the factors that were taken into calculation in 1882 were very similar to the factors that were taken into calculation in 1902, but they came up with very different conclusions in either one because of what happened between 1882 and 1902, based on the competition for colonial territories in Africa. Does that make sense? So the Bedouins were still considered to be dangerous, but they went with the danger of the Bedouins in 1902 as opposed to the danger of the British, and the opposite in 1882.
No change in the relationship with them.
No, of course there's a lot of change, but the change that took place is that the terms of arguing for how the telegraph line should be built were still the same. The relationship between the government, between the different various levels of government and the Bedouins were a lot more complicated than just as a whole. But in terms of how they argued for it in Istanbul, the Bedouins were always considered like a dangerous abstract notion.
I'm not quite sure that I understood about what happened in 1902. Did they, you said the telegraph lines of the Hijaz had ended. Did you mean it was completed?
Completed.
And
It started.
functioned
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it functioned with a lot of interruption, but it functioned, yeah.
Yeah, okay, so it wasn't, I thought it might.
No, I meant ended because in my head, no, it was, they start in 1900 and they start extending it, and it goes into operation to Medina. It never makes it to Mecca. It never makes it to Mecca, and it never makes it to Mecca. Even the Hijaz line in general never makes it to Mecca, and it's because of the Bedouin threat. But the Bedouin threat is not the Bedouin threat. The Bedouin threat is actually kind of a part of the competition between the Sharif of Mecca, the provincial governor, and Istanbul, that used the Bedouin threat as a way of masking some of their kind of stopping Istanbul from reaching deep into Sharif into the Sharif's territory.
You had an earlier map
Mm-hmm.
that more clearly than this
Mm-hmm.
showed the extent of their claims,
Mm-hmm.
and the British, French, and German colonization.
Mm-hmm. Let me get back to it. Close your eyes. This is going to make you nauseous because I'm going to go really quickly. Here? Is that?
Well, that could do. But it struck me that a great deal of that the boundaries, let's say, fuzzy as they would be,
Mm-hmm.
particularly in West Africa,
Mm-hmm.
but also extending across Chad and into the Sudan,
Mm-hmm.
really mirror the extent of Muslim population.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so there was
Was there an argument made for that?
religious sensibility
Mm-hmm.
to that claim.
Right.
And when the dust settles and the Ottoman Empire is no longer, all the West African countries extend northward into that Muslim territory.
Mm-hmm.
And, they have problems ever since.
Mm-hmm. I will take you back to the Ottoman argument and about why they believe they have the right to rule this territory as a colony, and it wasn't because they were Muslim. And I'll tell you why. And that's very unusual for Abdul Hamid. Abdul Hamid is known as the dude that carried the whole pan-Islamism argument.
No, I quite understand
Yeah.
your argument about their argument.
Right.
And they were playing because they wanted to play by the European rules.
When they're speaking with Europeans, yes.
Yeah. But
No, I mean, it wasn't that hidden when they're talking in the newspapers when people are discussing why is it that the Ottomans are actually making a play for Central Africa. Of course, a lot of, I mean, in the newspapers in Beirut and in Istanbul and in Cairo made the argument that if the French are going to claim Catholics and the Russians are going to claim the Orthodox and the British are going to claim the Druze, it makes full sense that the Ottomans would also have to be claim not the Muslims, but claim to be the protectors of Muslims and thus also the civilizers of Muslims in Central Africa. That kind of argument was there. It was definitely not used in this particular case. It's used in other cases, but you're absolutely right. I mean, there was a case to be made. But also there was a case to be made about the difference between the Ottomans and the people in Central Africa, and which took it in a different direction. So they argued for colonialism, but it's about the difference between the people that lived there and us, the civilized Istanbulus, if that makes sense. So it is. I hear what you're saying, but.
Well, and a great many of those Muslims are African, they're black Africans.
Uh,
They are certainly not Istanbul.
Yeah, I mean, right, but even the racialization of the argument doesn't come into the I mean, they were aware of the argument. They definitely did not use that argument till much later.
There are a lot of, it seems to me in many of these arguments, and we see it today in the United States, there's implicit bias
Hmm.
that is at work.
Oh, absolutely.
And never mentioned.
No, absolutely. So when I mentioned this idea of international law and where international law can be used and who does that apply to and who can use it to their advantage, the not even implied by the explicit notion that if you are not European, you are not a civilized nation and thus you do not deserve sovereignty, was very explicit. And that's part of why the Ottomans were, it's not just about playing the game, the imperial game, it's about them arguing backwards that they are to be considered a civilized nation and thus a sovereign nation. So you're absolutely, it was explicit, at least from in the new legalistic argument for colonialism from the mid-19th century onwards. It kind of existed implicitly before through natural law, and who does natural law apply to when we're talking about the Americas and so on.
Another, I'm coming at this from an Africanist point of view. Another thing that seems to me to have to do with John Pender
Mm-hmm.
would be the British preoccupation, which gets more, I would call it frantic,
Mm-hmm.
into the early 20th century about the route to
From north to south, yes.
and the absolute necessity of protecting that
Mm-hmm.
and making sure that the military transportation was secure.
Mm-hmm.
And I have always thought it was symbolic that the British took over finishing the Suez Canal and then in all their maps cut Africa off of the Middle East because in Africans, we can make an argument that certainly northern Africa and the Sahara and the Sahel bordering the south of the Sahara were, and what we call the Middle East were integrally connected
Mm-hmm.
until the expansion of British Empire sets the tone for
Mm-hmm.
all the other empires.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's an enormous symbolic.
It's I would say it's a lot more than just symbolic. I think a lot of it is the connection of what you own where connects to what you can claim sovereignty over comes from this notion of effective occupation through infrastructure projects, which the Ottomans themselves also played that game as well. And part of the reason they were so hesitant to let the British own infrastructure, even if it's just telegraph lines. But that the British didn't just, of course, they did this in sub-Saharan Africa. They did it as well with the Balkans and the connection between the Balkans and the Middle East. When I teach the Middle East, the Balkans are an integral part of it because I talk about the 19th century. The term is wrong because it's the Middle East, but I mean, part of it is disrupting this notion that it went before colonialism took place. Thank you. Absolutely.
So I want to go back to the racial aspect. And I wanted to ask, first of all, your opinion about Ottoman Orientalism.
Yes. I don't use it. I will talk. Yeah, I'll tell you in more detail. Continue.
Sorry, and just one more thing. You were talking about in the 80s, they're starting this legal or linguistic distinction between colonial possessions, and I wonder how they draw that line. If that has anything to do with their racial.
No. Yes. So thank you. Both very important questions. The Ottoman Orientalism business. I think a lot has been made of it, and I think it's had a distorting effect on late Ottoman imperialism. So what I mean by that is that did the notion of Ottomans, first of all, as I said, like navel gazing, self kind of observation of who they are versus others within the empire and outside of empire took place? Absolutely. Did they use a lot of the terms that we associate with European Orientalism of the East? Absolutely. Was it an animating a policy-making factor? Absolutely not. And that's where the distinction, that's where I make the distinction. And the reason is I try to go beyond the rhetoric. So I try to go beyond the rhetoric that would be considered either self-orientalizing or othering, to see how did their interaction with the same people that they're building a difference in the rhetoric, building a difference between the Ottoman ruler and the Ottoman non-ruler play on the ground. And that translation that would have been used in other empires does not translate on the ground in specific areas. When I say specific, at specific areas and specific times, the difference between those specific, did something, oh my, okay. I was like, did I go blind? The difference between where that kind of academic argument about whether Orientalism played a factor in how Ottomans strategized about their rule in specific areas does not come into the equation when they're talking about a possession, a colonial possession. And how they made that distinction? They made that distinction very consciously. What I mean by that is that it wasn't a racial distinction. Most of the people that lived, we're talking here about Tuareg and Bedouins, it reaches down to African, sub-Saharan Africans, but it also that the argument that they were making was not about race at all. They were aware of race. They were aware of arguments that are made about race by the British. That was not the argument they were making. They were making an argument when they are, and I really need to be very clear about this, when they are talking with their diplomatic counterparts in Europe, they were making the argument that was based on the law that I just talked about, not based on race, and and when they are discussing it between each other, they would actually have to correct each other about how to refer to it. because the Ottomans are not used to this distinction between a province and a colony, especially that the term colonial possession was so new. You would actually see they were so clear about it, or they were so careful about it, that you would see a lot of the documents in the Ottoman state. What you would have is you would have a scratch paper, like the how it's written usually by a low ranking katib that would write the first version, and that version usually goes through 3 iterations. And it's always, what's interesting is that at the beginning, the katib would actually make the mistake in interchanging mustamlakat with province, and the person on top would scratch it out in red in places that when we're talking about Tripoli, it would never be a mustamlakat. But we were talking about Tripoli's hinterland, it would be specifically mustamlakat. So, and it was about, it's a linguistic, but also a legalistic, and they kind of go hand in hand. So that's what I mean. It's a colony because they called it a colony, not because it's going to be a colony, not because it necessarily would have been. Does that make sense? Because they failed ultimately. Yes.
I lost your train of thought when, okay, so it wasn't a racialized
No.
argument.
Okay.
Then what is the reason why? That they distinguished this, okay, this is going to be a colony.
Oh, because this is new, or at least they're making the claim based on this window of opportunity in 1885, where law comes into it, and they're part of making that law. For them to expand their territory and re-enter global imperial kind of games by claiming a portion of land that would actually impact the 2 major powers at that time, the French and the British.
Really for like establishing a new form of sovereignty?
It's not no, it's not even established. It's. I believe that it extended further than that. It's claiming a new territory to kind of using international law arguments, but it goes beyond just claiming a new territory. It's about claiming their sovereignty as a nation that is civilized and thus can be colonized. You cannot, at this point, 1885 onwards, you're either kosher to be colonized or you're a colonizer.
So they're playing, is their way of playing the game of justifying, okay, this is our civilized nation?
No, not at all. I'm sorry, I keep doing this backwards. No, because you're trying, which a lot of people, you're trying to understand it through European terms of how they justified their colonial. And the Ottomans they had more serious issues to deal with, and that's their very own sovereignty, their very own understanding of their sovereignty by their European counterparts that was in danger at that time. And part of it is that if you accept us as lawmakers, law applies to us, our sovereignty, not just here, but in the Hijaz and other parts of the empire, should not be up for question. It should not be part of your desires to expand as people that legitimately, according to this law or according to European international law, that would legitimately have the right to covet the Ottoman Empire as a polity that is not recognized as a sovereign polity. Does that make sense? A little, okay, yeah, well, yes.
I have 2 questions.
Yes.
I'm not so sure about one thing. If you leave the legal language of 1885 aside,
Mhm.
what makes Osman's campaign of mission Central Africa different from Ottoman policies in the other lands of Arabia, particularly incorporating regions like Kuwait or Oman or even Basra, for which they were competing with British?
Mm-hmm.
And for the second question is, you again claim and show that 1885 is a turning point for use of this legal
Mhm.
fiction, I would call it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And in what way, or do you think that it's the first time that the Ottomans were using this, trying to play the game with European rules? Because what I have in mind is after 1840s, the entire
Of course, but that's different.
of Egypt, and especially after 1882,
Yeah.
the
That's different.
It's a legal fiction and they claim sovereignty rights over Egypt, shared it with Britain.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
They have no real thought.
Absolutely.
So they were playing with these things even before the 1885, in my opinion. Like,
Not with this thing. So I hear what you're saying, and I love how we love to do this with the Ottoman Empire. It's like such a huge empire that lasted for hundreds of years, and we kind of try to make associations between what they did in a specific part of land at a specific time with what they're doing in a different part of in a very specific time. We would never do this with the British Empire. We would never do this with the French Empire because we give them the benefit of thinking that they have specific reasons to do specific things at specific times in specific areas. We try and make these connections that in some cases do not apply because we're thinking of the Ottoman Empire as we're amorphizing the Ottoman Empire as if it's like a being. It is, I don't think of it this way. And I think that the Ottomans have done different things with the Europeans for centuries using different arguments, some of them legalistic, some of them are not, creating fiction as well. I'm not arguing that this is the first time they're creating what you term fiction. I'm arguing that this is the first time that they are using international law to claim this specific territory as a colony. That's different. So yes, of course they've interacted with Europeans. That's all that they've interacted with. No, I mean even creating agreements that would I hear 1882 onwards in Egypt, creating agreements with specific powers. Absolutely, that is not what I'm talking about. That is not the turning point. Is not about making agreements that might be fictional, but in reality keep the Ottoman Empire with the sense of sovereignty when it reality did not have it. This is not my bag. That's okay. That's okay. And I'm expecting this from Ottomanists because the way we think about the Ottoman Empire is a very yeah. Right. No, exactly. So even dealing with borderlands, so this argument, especially when we're talking about borderlands, even in the southern borderlands, the southern frontiers, dealing with the southern frontiers, which I try to bring into that's why I'm dealing with them in the same book. Dealing with the southern frontiers in Yemen is very different than dealing with their frontiers in Fezzan and south of it. Do you get what I'm saying? And they can make two different strategies that would reflect their desires in the two different areas based on, of course, the dangers that they're feeling from European powers as well. Do you understand what I'm saying? Do you get, or am I misunderstanding your question? Okay. Oh, so Abyssinia, really? We're calling it Abyssinia? They, after 1902, the Abdul Hamid and Sans Azamzadeh and other people as well to deal with Menelik II to try and figure out ways in which the two kind of empires can create an imperial alliance in Africa when they're both under in danger from the same power. It keeps going back and forth for about 9 years, and Ottoman cards that they can play are very specific that I would rather not talk about now because I haven't written the article, so it's just I don't.
We'll end the public portion of the lecture now, and everybody who's in the class, stick around for the next little bit.
Thank you.